When you look at all the chatter around Sony's Marvel projects, one rumor has really grabbed people's attention: the idea that Sony is working on an animated Venom movie. This would be a pretty big move, because it could signal a new direction for the studio now that the live-action Venom trilogy with Tom Hardy has wrapped up. According to a scoop that started making the rounds online, Sony has put this animated Venom project into development. Fans immediately began speculating about what this might mean for the future of Eddie Brock, the symbiote, and the larger Spider-Man universe that Sony keeps experimenting with. This rumor actually lines up with some earlier reports from March 2024 that hinted Sony Pictures Animation was already developing a Venom-related project. Back then, people were saying Seth Rogen was attached as a writer and producer. That detail alone made fans curious, because Rogen has built a strong reputation for handling edgy comic book stories. He's been involved with Preacher, The Boys, Invincible, and The Boys Presents Diabolical, so he knows his way around dark, violent, and often twisted material. If Sony really is going the animated route with Venom, then Rogen's involvement makes perfect sense, because his style fits the character like a glove. What makes the reports even more interesting is that this animated Venom movie is supposedly going to be R-rated. That's a huge shift when you compare it to the PG-13 rating that the live-action trilogy had. It also matches Rogen's past projects, which leaned heavily into mature themes. He's even admitted before that he avoided Marvel or DC movies because he didn't want to get boxed in by their studio systems. In a 2023 interview, he basically said that he and his team are control freaks, and plugging into such a massive system scared them. But animation might give him the freedom to do Venom justice in his own way. Of course, none of this has been officially confirmed by Sony, but the timing of the rumor is worth noting because it comes right after Venom: The Last Dance, which released in 2024 as the third and final live-action Venom movie with Tom Hardy. That movie wrapped up Eddie Brock's story, got mixed reviews, and ended by introducing a very important character from the comics, Null the Symbiote God. This set the stage for bigger things down the line, even if the live-action Venom saga is technically over. Null is no small deal. In the comics, he's known as the King in Black, a title that carries enormous weight across the Marvel multiverse. The title comes from the Celestials, who brought light and creation into existence, forcing Null and his abyss of darkness into the shadows. To balance things out, he was meant to serve as a kind of cosmic counterpart to the Beyonders, also known as the Kings in White. But Null hated the Celestials for intruding on his dark kingdom, and he lashed out. Using his powerful sword, the All Black, he even managed to decapitate a Celestial before being banished. That severed head later became Nowhere, which Guardians of the Galaxy fans know well. What makes this even more exciting is that the All Black eventually fell into other hands in the comics, like Gore the God Butcher, who appeared in Thor: Love and Thunder. So there's already a web of connections between Null's mythology and the Marvel movies we've seen. In Venom: The Last Dance, the sword makes an appearance, tying everything together. In the comics, Null's story leads to some of the biggest Marvel crossover events ever. From his abyss, he created the symbiotes, but they eventually betrayed him. Imprisoned on Klyntar, he was later freed thanks to Carnage, which kicked off 2019's Absolute Carnage event. That was the prelude to the massive King in Black storyline in 2020. In it, Null unleashed his army of symbiote dragons, took over planets, and eventually invaded Earth. The Avengers, X-Men, Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, and pretty much every other Marvel hero had to band together to fight him. The scale of the event was wild, with Null even ripping the Sentry in half like it was nothing and covering Earth in a blanket of symbiotes that blocked out the sun. Eddie Brock played a central role in that storyline. He died at one point, but his son Dylan's unique ability to control and destroy symbiotes became key to the resistance. Eventually, Eddie was resurrected with the power of the Enigma Force, which turned him into Captain Universe. Armed with Thor's hammer and Silver Surfer's board, Venom forged a cosmic weapon that rivaled Null's own power. The final showdown ended with Eddie throwing Null into the sun, vaporizing him, and taking his place as the new King in Black. Dylan then stepped into the role of Venom. All of that is massive comic book lore, and it makes you wonder how much of it Sony might actually adapt. If they go down this path, it could end up being the biggest Marvel movie Sony has ever attempted. But it's also tricky, because the comics involved heroes like Thor and Silver Surfer who belong to the MCU. Sony might not have access to all those characters, so maybe their version of King in Black would lean more heavily on Spider-Man characters and villains, or even variants from across the Spider-Verse. That could still make for an epic story, even if it's scaled down. The MCU has already shown that it doesn't always stick closely to the comics when adapting big events. Civil War, for example, looked very different from the comic storyline, and Age of Ultron did too. So it wouldn't be surprising if Sony takes the same approach with King in Black. They could keep the essence of Null's story without trying to adapt every single detail. The important thing is that Null has already been teased in live action, which makes him a natural candidate for a major storyline going forward. There's also the question of whether Sony and Marvel Studios will team up again to make this happen. The comics made it clear that Null is a threat to the entire multiverse, not just Spider-Man's corner of it. That could mean the King in Black story might work best as a crossover involving MCU characters too. If Sony and Marvel collaborate the way they did for the Spider-Man movies, fans could get a truly epic event on par with Avengers: Secret Wars. At the same time, there's uncertainty about Spider-Man's future in both the MCU and Sony's universe. Tobey Maguire's version of the character has already fought Venom, but Tom Holland's hasn't. Spider-Man: No Way Home even teased the possibility when Eddie Brock briefly appeared in the MCU and left behind a piece of the symbiote. That seemed like it was setting up a future storyline where Holland's Peter Parker would get the black suit, but now it doesn't look like Spider-Man 4 is going to follow through on that. Instead, the same kind of setup has popped up in the animated Disney Plus series Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man. The show ended its first season with a similar twist. A piece of the symbiote gets left behind after an interdimensional mess caused by Norman Osborn. The hint here is that Norman might end up experimenting with the symbiote in Season 2 or even bonding with it himself. That would create a venomized version of Osborn, which is a pretty wild direction to take things. Because of all this, some fans are starting to think the animated series might deliver the symbiote story that people expected from Spider-Man 4. The show has more flexibility since it doesn't have to worry as much about character rights or big universe connections. It can just focus on telling its own story, which means it might actually give fans the kind of Venom connection they've been waiting for. And that wraps up today's video. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.